Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today for a webinar session on the E of ESG, where our focus for discussion today will be on the environmental aspect of the ESG considerations. Well, once upon a time, the sole objective of business owners was to build a company that would generate revenues and continuously increases profits. And previously, most people understand environmental risks as those only affecting major oil and gas companies like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. But the Southeast Asian haze season, driven by deforestation and agricultural fires, and closer to home, you and I, with the recent impact of the pollution to Sungai Gong, which has caused over 1.2 million Malaysian users in Klang Valley facing abrupt water cuts, have somewhat made all of us, including the authorities, realize the critical importance of looking after our environment more diligently. So the impact of climate change to businesses can no longer be ignored. Environmental risks are in actual fact a global issue, a hidden danger to business and potentially landmines. If we are not careful, as it affects every individual, community, organization and country with serious implications on businesses, which can lead to operational disruptions and losses for organizations. And over and above that, if you have followed our inaugural ESG session at the in-house council webinar last week, it is also noted that demonstrating that you have incorporated ESG considerations into your business, which include having taken measures to mitigate and manage environmental risks and issues in your companies, will allow you to also have better access to financing and fundings, as financiers and investors are increasingly putting emphasis on the ESG requirement in its financing and investment decision. Today, I have a panel of 4 partners across our ASEAN offices who will help us to decipher what are the main environmental risks to businesses, understand the reason for the need to consider such environmental risks seriously, and rationalize the business case for action. Let me first introduce you to all of them. We have Fajar Kanda. He's the co-managing partner of our Indonesian office. He has been recognized as a leading Indonesian lawyer with considerable experience of over 25 years, advising local and multinational companies in the energy, natural resources, and infrastructure sectors. We also have Kevin Hawks, a partner in our Vietnam office. He is an accomplished US lawyer who has extensive experience in advising on a variety of issues in Vietnam, having spent the past 17 years in Vietnam. So he advises from oil and gas, power, M&A, property development to international trade. In Malaysia, of course, we have Hua Xia Yen, a project partner from our office in KL. She advises on major land development projects such as the Tanjung Aru Eco Development and Iskandar, Malaysia. She also has considerable experience working on the REITs for some of the major property development in towns, such as the Axis UOA and Sunway REITs. Koo Yulin, who used to head our office in Myanmar, is back in KL office as a project partner. She currently advises the government on the drafting of the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Bill. We'll get more out of her later on this. And she's also very active in advising companies on energy efficiency projects. She is a true blue, strong advocate on environment and sustainability issues. Before we get started, just notice we have a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to post your questions to our panelists using the Q&A feature. However, if we are unable to answer all your questions during the webinar, we will try to send you, our answers directly to your email. So please leave your name, the company that you're working for, and in your questions to us. Okay, let's get started. Understandably, there are many types of risks inherent in any business, particularly in today's challenging market. Most companies actually wouldn't dream of operating without an accounting team, an IT team, or a HR team. But yet they having a team, and putting resources to look after environmental risks specifically are somehow still considered discretionary in most companies. So I'm just wondering whether it could be a case of lack of understanding on climate change issue and the exposure which environmental risks could potentially bring to businesses. So Yulin, perhaps you can help us to understand this better. tell us exactly what is corporate climate action and why companies need a paradigm shift and take action to address the environmental risks. Over to you, Yulin.
Thanks, Kihui. Afternoon. I hope everyone is staying positive and testing negative. So let's start first with climate action. What is climate action? We are facing a climate breakdown that is undeniable, and climate action is about increasing our efforts to save the environment, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to live in a way that's more sustainable, and at the same time, taking steps to strengthen our resilience to climate-induced impacts. So corporate climate action is about corporations, companies, businesses taking that climate action, taking and placing greater value and emphasis on the environment and taking climate protection as part of their business operations and corporate processes. Next slide, please. Companies cannot underestimate the impact of the environment, the risk to it to their business. I'd just like to highlight some of these examples. Firstly, in America, Peabody Energy. It's a major coal producer. When Trump came into power, he pulled out of the Paris Agreement and introduced coal-friendly regulations. Those in the renewable sector thought that that was the end for renewables, but in 3.5 years, Peabody's energy shares have dropped 96%. And to me, it's a sobering example that despite regulations favoring coal, the markets aren't buying it. They are looking to the future, and the future is green. Industries that pollute and leave a high carbon footprint are being ditched for cleaner alternatives. Klang Valley, we experienced back-to-back water cuts, and it was due to pollution. The disruption it caused to households, to businesses, it just exacerbated the stress we already faced due to COVID-19. And in my third example, a few years ago, we saw a Malaysian palm oil company its share price dropping by 17% after it was suspended by the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. It was also dropped as a supplier by 3 major companies. Again, the bottom line is environmental issues have economic consequences. Next slide, please. So why the focus on corporations? Companies produce practically everything that we purchase, consume, and dispose. This has led to environmental issues connected to climate change, pollution, sustainability, and waste generation. As such, going to the source, corporations have the ability to bring about the biggest impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, pollution levels, and waste in the shortest time. So why should corporations take note? This is not a case about appealing to the morals of corporations to do the right thing. Of course, it's the right thing to do, but there is a business case for corporations to pivot from brown to green. Planning and managing climate risk issues is increasingly becoming part of corporate governance, i.e. it's a fiduciary duty of care owed by the board of members. To quote the founder of the Climate Governance Initiative, failure to identify potential climate risks is a potential failure of corporate governance. Irrespective of their personal beliefs or present knowledge, directors will not be able to argue in the future, say 5 years' time, that they did not know it was going to be destructive to the ecosystem and to the business, as climate change has been identified as the defining issue of our time. Just to point out the case of Exxon, they are currently facing multiple legal suits for deceiving shareholders on the track of climate change. Last year, a group of Exxon investors filed a suit against the company officials and the board members. They said the officials knew, were reckless, or were grossly negligent in not knowing that Exxon was misleading its investors regarding the risks of climate change to its business. Next, please. Another reason why corporates should take note. It is a crucial business strategy to mitigate or future-proof your business from the impact of climate change. Firstly, stakeholders' expectations. Everyone from customers to investors, they are expecting that a company is environmentally friendly. Customers want to know that they are shopping with a company that has a climate plan, that cares for the environment, and then what they're buying isn't harming the planet. Investors want to know that a company they're investing in is climate change resilient. And as mentioned by Kiwi just now, access to financing. In Malaysia, major banks have already started incorporating ESG and sustainability considerations into their lending guidelines, and green financing comes with additional incentives. And finally, businesses need to be aware and ready for the impact from government intervention. BNM has indicated that financial institutions will be required to report their exposure to climate risks, and the information that is gathered is going to be used to come up with regulatory standards to govern climate change. Just to point out, EU is proposing to come up with a carbon border tax. So this will be a tax that is levied on goods imported from the rest of the world, and it will be levied based on their CO2 content. So in the past, where there may be a financial advantage of getting goods from China, Vietnam, Malaysia, but once they cross the border and are imposed with a carbon tax, it may not be so financially advantageous for the company to source from these countries. So some things to take into consideration. Take note as well, China has come up with its very strong climate goals to be carbon neutral by 2060. And we saw Biden, known as the climate president, and he has just won, depending whether you're a Trump supporter or not. But he has just won the presidency. And again, he has a very strong climate proposal. Next, please. And just to point out, in terms of the impact of environmental considerations on share prices and corporate bonds, the Chartered Financial Analyst Institute, they undertook an extensive survey among participants from the financial sector on how often ESG issues impacted on share prices, corporate bond yields, and sovereign debt yields. While the impact of ESG is expected to increase overall in 2022, the anticipated impact of environmental issues alone more than doubled in every category. You can see from the red arrow where I pointed out the percentages. So once again, this underscores the business case for corporations to make climate change mitigation and sustainability part of its business processes. Thank you. Back to you, Kiwi.
Thanks, Yulin. It's clear to me that the need to manage the environmental risks are not just about doing good for the community, as you say, it's not philanthropic and just CSR, but makes great commercial sense. As not only it will ensure sustainable business, but I see it as a governance requirement as well going forward. Let's go to the regional partners. Kevin, can you tell us, has the ESG movement caught on in Vietnam, especially on environmental issues?
Sure. Hi, QA. Thank you. Yeah, ESG is a fairly new concept still in Vietnam, although it's becoming more recognized by the government and investors in recent years. The establishment of the Vietnam Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is a business-led organization under the NGO Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry in December 2010, really marked a significant change in the awareness of both enterprises and investors towards sustainable development in Vietnam. In 2010, the Vietnam Green Building Council introduced Lotus. It's the first green building rating system tailored for Vietnam's building regulations, climate conditions, and construction practices. The Lotus contains many systems that cover most building types, including non-residential and multifamily residential existing buildings and so forth. And it serves as a framework and planning tool to create healthy, environmentally friendly, and cost-saving buildings. It's top reasons to go green in Vietnam, and at least in the residential real estate sector, mostly for environmentally friendly and cost-saving buildings, but also to provide certified green real estate products to end users and home buyers, and to differentiate their products from the rest of the market. Local developers, especially in the residential segment, are now joining the green movement and finding it very beneficial for their projects going forward with customers. The Vietnam banks have also committed with international funds to finance millions of USD loans to green projects. Recently, TB Bank signed a long-term loan agreement with for green credit loans up to $20 million with the Global Climate Partnership Fund. This has opened up more opportunities for project companies to access capital funds with attractive interest rates for environmental protection projects. Some companies in Vietnam already, such as Capital Land and Easy Land, have already adopted and introduced ESG policies and plans. In fact, recently the American Chamber of Commerce established an ESG committee. The ESG committee plays a central role in identifying Vietnamese and global ESG standards and best practices, in promoting ESG standards locally, and in assisting AmCham members to achieve best practices and sustainable development and objectives in Vietnam. With respect to the government, however, on that side, the State Bank of Vietnam has issued a directive in 2015 promoting green credit growth and environmental social risks management and credit granting activities. The Ministry of Finance issued a circular in 2016, which requires listed companies to disclose ESG information. And the state authorities have also held various campaigns over the last several years in terms of a Go Green campaign operated by the Ministry of Culture, Tourism, and for environmental protection, and Action Month for Environment that was hosted by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment in June this year, and then finally a Green Environment campaign that was sponsored by the Phu Yen province in September this year, which focused on recycling, reusing, and minimizing waste at the source and cleaning the environment. So these are the types of things that are going on now in Vietnam in terms of the E part of ESG.
Well, it looks like in Vietnam, the trend is that it's also moving towards incorporating ESG into businesses. Let's look at what's happening in Indonesia, Fajar. Does the Indonesian government and corporates there care about ESG considerations and the need to have that incorporated in their business operations, particularly from the perspective on the environment?
Thank you, Kihi, for the good question. The ESG in Indonesia, I think is quite similar like in Vietnam, where it is seen to be a relative new concept, but it has been practiced actually by government and by private sectors. We've seen a growing awareness in Indonesia on sustainability and the importance of green investing, i.e. investing in companies that support or provide environmentally friendly products and practices and develop also environmentally products and goods. In terms of the government awareness, I think the authorities in the financial sector is pioneering the concept of ESG. For example, the Financial Services Authority, or Ojk, already published what is called a roadmap for sustainable finance in Indonesia for the time span of 2015 and 2019 in order to promote sustainable financing specifically. In addition, Ojk also issued regulations to support green bonds issuance. In addition, the Ministry of Finance also has issued Green Sukuk in 2018, and the Sharia compliant debt instrument, or is called ST006 Green Savings Retail Sukuk. It is meant to fund environmentally friendly infrastructure projects in the country. And then we think that Ojk predicts that green bond markets in Indonesia and around the world will continue to grow. Hence, Ojk is pioneering the initiative on behalf of the government. Well, speaking of ESG, well, it is also important to know that CSR is in Indonesia is actually quite popular as compared to ESG. But unlike CSR, ESG has not been specifically regulated for corporate practices. In fact, in terms of CSR-related regulations, take, for example, the company's law contains provision which oblige companies to carry out social environmental responsibilities, and these activities or initiative must be budgeted and calculated as company expense. And what is also worth noting that under the company law, a company may be subjected to certain administrative sanctions if it fails to comply with such obligation. So CSR has been regulated under the Indonesian regulatory regime, but not necessarily ESG. Obviously, the financial sector has started. The environmental protection are specifically regulated under environmental law and was recently amended by the omnibus law called the Job Creation Law. I will speak about that later. And on whether there is a need to have ESG, I think particularly on the environmental aspect incorporated into the business operation, I think the answer is yes. And environmental protection is heavily regulated in Indonesia, especially for those who conduct business in natural resources and energy sector. This means that ESG should be incorporated in the corporate policies. Well, with the growing awareness of green financing or investing in sustainability, we urge that companies should look into implementing these ESG principles in order to position their businesses better against the future carbon-related regulation and shifting their energy policy positions and energy transition. I think that's what we can share from Indonesia.
Thank you, Fajar. It's interesting to note that CSR is actually regulated under the Indonesian companies law. Maybe, if we have time, we can explore that a little bit more. I'm sure the audience are interested to find out more. But it looks like your ESG movement in Indonesia, particularly on environmental considerations, are very much driven by financing requirement from lenders and institutional investors. I also noted from Yulin's earlier statistic, the study done by CFA earlier, that environmental considerations will increase by more than twofolds by next year, perhaps more now with the COVID situation in affecting the price of shares, bonds, and debt yields. Given the increasing importance of environmental considerations, let's get Yen to try to decipher for us and share with us from her experience what are the top environmental issues which investors should be aware of. Yen?
Thank you, Ki Hui. Hi everyone. Hope everyone is keeping well. So the way a company handles environmental issues can affect the sustainability and value of the company. Whether your company or your investors are taking the environmental issues seriously, and whether there's a proper governance of the environmental issues in your company. As a GC, what's our role in ensuring there's an environmental risk assessment and compliance procedure during the planning of a proposed development and the existing business activities of your company? I would like to share with you the first case study is a land development. We advise a project promoter in relation to a beachfront eco-friendly and sustainable development. We went through the environmental issues and regulatory requirements together with the client and its consultant team consisting of engineers and environmental consultants to ensure that the development plan provides for environmental mitigation measures. From the photos, the existing environmental condition is an eyesore, underdeveloped and polluted. It has limited social, environmental, or economic value. The sand and water are contaminated, polluted, and subject to continuous erosion. Hence, the need to have this project to rejuvenate the park and beach, which will cost approximately 2 billion ringgit, with an estimated annual maintenance cost of 50 million ringgit. As part of the applications, for the Special Environmental Impact Assessment approval, the Terms of Reference report has been prepared based on scoping of the sensitivities of the receiving environment at the project site and potential environmental impact arising from the implementations of the project. The slide shows environmental issues that have been categorized into 3 categories. We will not go into all the issues in detail. We will just highlight the focus issues, which are negative issues of greatest concern that require the most attention during the SEIA study that entails detailed analysis. Natural habitat impact, change in beach and landscape character. Although the project will address existing erosion problems and improve the beach quality, it would indefinitely change the nature of the environment from natural to a more built-up landscape, including resorts. The issue of note such as water pollution, social economic impact, these issues require serious considerations and a substantive analysis, and all these issues will be clearly set out in the SEIA report. Next slide. So now under the Malaysian Environmental Quality EQA, apart from the perpetrator, it extends liability to owners, occupiers of premises. In addition, it extends liability to the principal for any act committed in the course of employment by its servants or agents. If the company has committed offense, liability will also be attached. This is for the GC to take note. Director, manager, or similar officer or a partner of the company or firm. In the EQA, there's a presumption of innocence that will be reversed, as they are deemed guilty unless they can prove that offense was committed without their knowledge and that all reasonable precautions have been taken and due diligence exercised. Thank you.
Thanks, Yen. That's helpful guidance. Let's hear from Kevin. Kevin, what are the environmental law requirements in Vietnam? And as investors making decision to invest in Vietnam, what are the particular issues and considerations that they must take note of? Could you give us some insights?
Sure, QA. Thank you very much. If we could pull up the slide, I'll explain a little bit about the compulsory obligations and voluntary obligations that companies have here. Now, compulsory obligations are obviously the must-haves, right? So developing an environmental impact assessment plan or an environmental protection plan, depending on the size of your project, is required under law. And then implementing that plan or in accordance with the requirements that are set out both in the plan and under the regulations is also a requirement, in addition to carrying out the environmental protection measures in the manner that you've set out in that plan as well. So then you're also required to prevent and restrict adverse impact on the environment from your activities as investors in Vietnam, and to take appropriate minimization and management activities towards waste. Then if there is any issue, you're required to rectify any environmental pollution that's created by any of those activities, and then pay environmental taxes and protection charges that may be applicable. Now, the nice to haves or the voluntary obligations would be carrying out environmental auditing, green credits and green investment type programs, proposing and implementing public-private partnership projects in environmental protection sector. Implementing higher environmental standards than what are required by law is also nice to have, including technical standards on quality of soil, water, air, noise, light, and radiation. And controlling, collecting, reusing, and recycling waste. And finally, developing and using green products and renewable energy sources. And because people like case studies, I just want to take 1 minute to give you one of the most famous cases here in Vietnam, which is in 2008, the Vidan Vietnam, which is a foreign invested company, and an MSG manufacturer here, was found illegally to be discharging untreated wastewater into the Ti Vai River in the Dong Nai province. Now, why is this important? Because while this shows a gap between the actual fines, legal fines, and the larger impacts, because the fines against Vidan only amounted to about $12,000 US. But in addition to that, there was another charge of $6 million US that had to be paid as environmental remediation fees that carried out. In addition to that, another $9.5 million had to go towards compensating farmers and other locals in that area who were damaged by the environmental pollution that was caused by Vidan Corporation. Now, those are the financial toll. But in addition to that financial toll, it extended further because then wholesalers and retailers refused to carry Vidan products in their stores in Vietnam, which caused serious reputational harm and long-term damage to the company here. I just want to mention those as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That's helpful. Fajar, what about in Indonesia? Does it pay for companies in Indonesia to carry out environmental friendly or sustainable projects?
Thank you, Kihui. Yes, certainly to some extent, obviously. Well, like I mentioned earlier, there is already environmental law which about the safeguard of the regulatory framework for environmental regime. And then in terms of ESG, there is a growing awareness of ESG, although it's relatively new. But because of government also growing awareness on the sustainability, and it's already reflected in very few regulations that I mentioned earlier in the financial sector. And then we believe it does pay off for companies to be mindful of promoting and implementing environmentally friendly or sustainable projects or initiatives. And then let me give you 3 examples, as you can see in the slide, why it is worth considering. The government has issued regulations that provide incentive for carrying out green or sustainable initiative. The first one would be carbon credits. Indonesian government has introduced what is called the Nusantara Carbon Scheme, or SKN for short, which is an alternative mechanism that can be used as a policy aid in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. SKN provide opportunities for private parties or private sectors to be actively participate in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The carbon credit from SKN can be used to offset or compensate the buyer or the greenhouse gas emission users. In this case, the Indonesian government is expected to provide incentive to these private parties involved in the issuance of SKN, either to carbon providers or to carbon users. The second thing that I would like to mention is that Ojk's regulations on green bond. In line with the Sustainable Finance Program promoted by Ojk, the Ojk supports the national government program on battery-powered electric motor vehicle, or BPEV, acceleration program, which was launched by the national government in 2019. Under this initiative, Ojk encourages national banks or local banks to participate actively in providing loans and in order to meet this accelerated program by the government. Under this program, it is encouraged for the local banks to launch programs that are pretty much acceptable for the BPEV manufacturers. The third one that I would like to mention is the Ojk Sustainability Report. Under this requirement, issuers or public companies or financial institutions which implement sustainable finance can be given incentive by Ojk. The incentive can be given in the form of involving these issuers, public companies, or financial institutions in the Human Resource Competency Development Program. In addition, Ojk also publishing or issuing or awarding rather the Sustainable Finance Award to these issuers, public companies, or financial institutions. There are also other incentive, but I won't be able to discuss this given the time. Surely this we can share you later on in the question and answer session. To answer your question, Kius, yes, it does pay off, and then the government and the private sector have already actually implemented this. Back to you, Kiwi. Thank you.
Thank you, Fajar. That's very encouraging to hear. So based on what I'm hearing so far from everyone, there is indeed a business case in embarking on environmental risk management. Question now is, how can a company contribute to address climate change issues? And perhaps a more practical question to ask is, what is there in there for companies in helping to contribute to address climate change issues? Perhaps Yulin, you can shed some lights on that, on how companies can, do better in addressing climate change issues, at the same time, make commercial sense out of it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kihui. What can companies do? Well, climate change issues, they are complex, and it does require a long-term strategy. Companies they're so diverse. There's different businesses, operations, size, customers, awareness levels at companies are also very different. So broadly, I would say it requires an assessment of your business risk and exposure to climate change, taking steps to manage and mitigate. And I know that's a very general, broad thing. So I think the most basic thing we can do to address the climate risk we have is to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emitted, and we can do that through reducing the amount of energy we use and using energy from a renewable source. COVID-19 has been devastating, but it has given us a glimpse of how the Earth can heal with reduced human activity. We actually saw a drop in greenhouse gas emissions from the decrease in energy consumption levels. But at the same time, to expect companies to reduce their energy consumption by pulling back on business activities and slowing down growth is wholly unrealistic. Here in Southeast Asia, we are a region that's still developing, and as our demand for energy will only grow as our economic status improves. So I think an initial step, if you're thinking where to start, an initial step a company can take is to look in-house, look at your own home and tackle the energy efficiencies in your own operations. So energy efficiency measures could be replacing an inefficient air cooling system, switching all your incandescent light bulbs to LED lighting, retrofitting the building to fix your leaky windows so that the cool air doesn't escape. These are all low-hanging fruits. They sound quite mundane, but they can achieve early wins. I'd just like to highlight that the International Energy Agency says that 40% can be achieved just through energy efficiency. Our emission cuts, 40% can be achieved just through energy efficiency. So having said all this, the thing going into your mind is replacing, switching, retrofitting. All that requires a high initial cost, and companies have a budgets to adhere to, and COVID-19 hasn't made it easier. So what can we do? So I think one way to address the lack of access to capital for carrying out EE projects and at the same time reducing the energy usage is through what we call energy performance contracting. So energy performance contracting is a mechanism where a third party, an energy service company, and normally we refer to it as an ESCO, they come in, they come up with the EE measures, and they come up with the capital as well to implement these EE measures, and the customer repays the ESCO through the savings in the energy bills. So just to take you through a typical EPC model, this is a generalization, but what happens is the ESCO goes into the facility and they do an audit to ascertain the current energy consumption. So they set a baseline, and then they identify the potential areas for savings. Parties then agree on, typically again, it's the ESCO that will bear the initial capital cost. There will be a performance guarantee level, and parties then will agree what will be the savings that will be shared between the parties from the savings. So let's say I can achieve savings of 15%. So out of this 15%, how do we share it between each other? And of course, there need to be adjustments and exclusions and for variables. And I also have to caution, once the EPC measures are implemented, it isn't a license for the customer to then go, I have retrofitted, I put in all these EE measures, so I'm going to turn on my lights 24/7, I'm going to turn on my air cooling system 24/7 and set it at 18 degrees Celsius. So it doesn't work that way. And typically the payback period as well is about 6 to 7 years. And once the payback period is over, the companies then can enjoy the full savings from the implemented EE measures. Next slide, please. Okay. I also just want to mention for completeness that renewable energy is also something that we also need to consider, because now renewable energy as an option is even more viable as well. Costs of solar panels have dropped significantly, and you may say we have pretty low prices here in Malaysia, but through solar PPAs and solar leasing options, solar developers can actually offer a further discount on the current electricity prices. So again, it seems like a no-brainer kind of decision. And I just want to highlight that there is a net energy metering scheme. So any excess electricity produced by the solar panels that you don't consume yourself, it can be sent back to the grid and offset on a one-for-one basis. But it is ending at the end of this year. So if you are thinking about applying for it, you should do so as soon as possible. But I recognize that installing solar panels may not be possible. Perhaps there's an issue of a lack of space. So purchasing renewable energy certificates can be considered. So the two companies I want to highlight is Sarawak Energy Berhad. They provide hydro RECs, and TNB with their My Green Plus. Next slide, please. Okay, I also just want to highlight that there are green incentives available. So I won't read through every single one, but I just want to highlight the Green Technology Financing Scheme is now at version 3.0. Under Budget 2021, it's announced that this scheme has been extended to 2022 and the fund size of 2 million. And there's also Green Investment Tax Allowance and Green Investment Tax Exemptions. This as well has been extended to 2023. These slides, I understand, will be shared with you later, so you can take your time to read through, and your website as well is clearly stated the criteria as well as the application form. So do check out the site for these green incentives as well. Okay, thank you, Kiwi.
Thank you, Yulin. Well, looks like it's really doable, to embark on some initiatives. There are low-hanging fruits like retrofitting your facility for better energy saving. That brings to mind, I remember years ago, a major European client of mine said that, look, Kiwi, I'm just going to focus on EE because that will help me to save a lot, on the operations cost. Now, coming back to how best to manage environmental risks, maybe let's have Siayen to, share with us what are the steps that companies can help to mitigate environmental risks, particularly, helping us to mitigate and, of course, avoid liabilities. Yan, can you share your experience in this aspect?
Yes,
thanks.
Definitely. There's a saying, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. As we advise our clients when they carry out their development, we always ask them the first question, have they done their EIA? Have they carried out their environmental impact assessment? So this is a very crucial factor that they need to take into account. So in relation to a construction and infrastructure project, the employer will engage an independent checking engineer and a consultant to prepare the EIA report. And the contractor will normally develop and implement an EMP. EMP is Environmental Management Plan to mitigate the potential impact on the environment during the constructions of the work, which will have to comply with the local regulations and recommendations contained in the EIA report. Where else? Land development involving land reclamation. There will be surveys and assessment as set out in the slides to be carried out by a qualified environmental consultant during the SEIA study. SEIA is Special Environmental Impact Assessment Study, and the Environmental Management and Monitoring Program. Environmental issues, mitigation measures, and monitoring program must be clearly set out in the report in order to obtain the SEIA approval from the authority before commencement of work. The director, this is for the GC to take note. The director of the contractor, the employer, each will have to submit a declaration to the authority that a briefing has been given by a qualified environmental consultant in relation to the contents of the SEIA report, and they must understand the risks and liabilities if there's any non-compliance on the conditions imposed. The next case study that we would like to share with you is to ask, why is it so important to conduct an EIA or environmental due diligence prior to a land acquisitions or acquisitions of a company? We received a call from a manufacturing company. When the company was acquired by a foreign co, the purchaser did not carry out any environmental due diligence on the land owned by the company. Now they realize there's environmental contamination within the land compound, and the management require our advice on their liability. As we discussed earlier, the director and the manager may be found guilty if there's actually pollution involved. Hence, it is very important to carry out the environmental due diligence prior to a land acquisitions or a company acquisition. The cost of inaction will far outweigh the cost of an environmental issues governance and risk assessment. Over to you, Ki Hui.
Thank you, Yan. Looks like, all of us needs to be very diligent going forward in making sure that various environmental assessments are made before embarking on any projects. With the recent pollutions in Sungai Gong and Sungai Kim Kim created quite a bit of uproar and inconveniences to all of us as water users. There are some actions, I know, taken by the government to reinforce certain laws, to ensure stringent enforcement of the environmental laws. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, definitely. We have a slide that shows the Selangor, the state of Selangor has recently passed an amendment bill to amend the LOAS enactment to include heftier penalties against polluters. These are the key amendments under the amendment bill. Maximum fine has been increased to 1 million and a mandatory jail term of not more than 3 years. The court may order forfeiture of assets seized even though no charges were made. And in fact, it also gives seizure power without a warrant to the director or the inspector rank and above police officer. It also allows cleaning costs of river to be claimed from polluters. And the definitions of pollutions has also been amended to include contaminations that affect taste and smells of the water at its source. You can see that environmental laws in Malaysia are expected to experience further development and changes as the general public's awareness of the importance of environmental protections, governance continues to increase. There has been proposal to increase the maximum fine for water pollutions under the EQA to 10 million ringgit from the existing 500,000. Thank you.
Thanks, Yan. With stricter rules and laws, hopefully we'll see less of a pollution. Well, Yulin, I know that you're part of a team helping the government in drafting the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act. I don't mean to get you into trouble, breaching your confidentiality obligation to the government, but it would be good if you could, give us some heads up and share, some of the things that we can expect to see from the EECA when it get passed as law. And also maybe, give us some of your perspective as to whether you foresee, the imposition of carbon tax anytime soon.
Okay, thanks, Kiwi. I'll try and see what I can share. Okay, so the government, I think a couple of months ago, they did say they are mulling the introduction of carbon tax as a way to manage climate change, but I think that's quite preliminary at the moment. It's something that I think needs to be further studied, how to do it, and where should you tax as well. I also know that I think over a year ago as well, it was reported that the government of Malaysia is already studying the feasibility of a separate climate change act. And I think they were working with the UK government on that front as well. In terms of Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, just to highlight, we do have energy efficiency laws, but they are geared towards only electricity. So they can be found in our Electricity Supply Act, now electricity regulations, and specifically also the efficient management of electrical energy. So it's all been electricity. So with the EECA, I think what I can say is it's not going to only encompass electricity. We'll also be looking at regulating the consumption of other forms of energy. And I mean, broadly as well, we're looking at 3 areas: residential, commercial, and industrial. So we do have our current laws regarding MAPS, minimum energy performance standards. So those are regulate the performance standards of certain appliances. So that will be enhanced. On the commercial side, there will be measures for commercial buildings, and we could be looking at disclosure of building energy levels. So what this means is a building will need to disclose what is their level of energy consumption, and it has been seen in other jurisdictions that when you disclose it, it tends to lead to this effect where owners start to then compete and try to keep their energy levels low as well. And it also makes the building more attractive to rent or to buy because it's energy efficient. In terms of industrial, because high energy consumers tend to come from the industrial sector, we'll be perhaps looking at having an energy management system and having more detailed reporting requirements. So I think that's about the minimum that I can say at the moment, Kiwi. Thanks.
Thank you. That's enlightening, Yulin. Thank you for sharing. Kevin, what about Vietnam? I heard there would be more stringent requirements on environmental protection law there. Can you tell us more about that, and how would that impact business operations in Vietnam?
Sure. Thanks, Kiwi. Put up the slide for a second, but the current environmental protection law we have dates back to 2014. So given Vietnam's perspective, it's about 6 years now on, so it's the time to revise the law and put in more stringent requirements, as well as some other environmental friendly features for investors. So the draft law is going to propose not only just stringent requirements on environmental protection, which are going to be like requiring enterprises and to submit their environmental impact assessment reports. But those are now going to be made public by the state authorities. So that's a new feature, that'll now become public information. But they're also going to put in steps that are going to promote environmental protection activities. So the draft law proposes certain incentives to encourage enterprises to engage in more environmental projects. Now those specifically in the draft law, they're proposing the production and supply of waste treatment technologies, manufacture and trading environmentally friendly products, producing and supplying environmental monitoring equipment, and investing in waste collection, and also investing in improving the technology for treatment of waste and other products. So you might ask, what are these incentives that they're proposing? Well, they include financial capital support, includes land use fee exemption, and it'll include corporate income tax, both exemption and reductions, and then price subsidies on environmental friendly products. One of the other features of the draft proposed law is going to be the introduction of the legal framework for the emission market, which will allow for carbon trading and also emission quotas trading. And there's a pilot program now being placed for specifically for the steel sector and for the solid waste sectors. So that's what we're expecting from the new environmental law when that comes out soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Going to Indonesia, Fajar, is the Indonesian government doing more to curb pollutions? I think personally, I wanted to ask, about the issue of haze. Is the government doing more to try to, reduce pollution and, cause us the inconvenience of having the haze issue? Thanks.
Thank you, Kihui. Yes, certainly. The Indonesian government has go against the polluters caused by haze, which as you know, haze is mainly caused by deforestation, which happened in some part of Sumatra areas like in Riau, and then some parts in Kalimantan, like in Central Kalimantan. As you know, haze has caused issues for our good neighboring countries like Malaysia and Singapore. As a result, President Joko Widodo has ordered the head of National Disaster Management Authority and the National Army, as well as the Chief of Police, to immediately resolve the forest fires issues that are arisen in the Riau and Central Kalimantan. I think as a result of this initiative, there are a number of companies have been brought to the court of law, and some of them have been persecuted. And the answer to the question on whether the Indonesian government will draft more stricter environmental laws, I think that's a good question to be asked, given that there is a omnibus law and which is titled Job Creation Law, and this omnibus law has created some changes to the environmental provisions under the environmental law. One of the big changes is that there is a different concept now for polluters. Previously, there was a concept called strict liability, but I think at the moment it has been shifted by the government, so that the burden of proof now is with the investigators, not so much on the polluters. And the other aspect that I want to touch on is whether or not is worthwhile passing the new stricter laws, or whether there is a need for actually ensuring the current existing law pertaining to environment in order for our environment to be better protected. And then the answer to that question, I think, yes, given that it's more pressing issue as expected by the private sectors and private companies, meaning that we are expecting that enforcement environmental aspect is needed, as opposed to having more stricter environmental laws. But there is one thing also that I would like to touch on. Even though environmental protection is something that has to be considered, but what is most important is that the private sectors or the private companies now need to be aware that there are cases, actual cases were brought to the court against these private companies. One of the case involved a dumping of what is called a by way of submarine tailing disposals, because the alleged dumping was considered to be done without any license issued by the government. The case was arising because there was effects around the local community, which caused the local community to be evacuated. Around 70 families were evacuated. As a result of this case, the president director was detained, and I think there was a long process of the court, but eventually the government or the court did not find any proof against the company. The other case that I want to touch on is the most recent case involving a dumping of hazardous waste. I think the case is still ongoing, but what the case tells me that actually this case is probably going to be one of the good examples for practice of companies who has or produces hazardous waste to be more careful in terms of dumping their waste into the ground or into their surroundings. The lesson learned from these cases are that even though there are stricter environmental law and on one side, and we know that there are weak in terms of enforcement, but there are cases being brought to the court of the law. And as a result, these cases have impacted the companies because they have to endure the long process of legal proceedings, and obviously there are plenty of costs to bear. I think that's the sharing that I can provide to you, Kiwi, at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fajar. I think, yeah, we are running out of time a bit. Perhaps maybe we'll just take one question very quickly. Kevin, there is a question for you, from obviously, I think, investors in Vietnam. There was a question to ask about whether there's any case examples involving foreign invested companies that have run afoul of Vietnam's environmental laws, and what were the consequences. Would you be able to quickly share on that before we wrapped up?
Hi, QA, sure. I did give one example, but it's a fairly old example from 2008. So let me give you a more recent example from June 2019, just last year, where AB Mori, which is a division, and I hope they're not online, one of our listeners right now, but they're part of AB Foods Group. But AB Mori Vietnam produces yeast, is a yeast manufacturer here in Vietnam, nearby Ho Chi Minh City. And they were found they were charged with not following the laws in terms of disclosing their environmental report and failing to garner the community opinions regarding their environmental facilities. You have to get a collective community opinion about your environmental treatment facilities as part of your action program, and they failed to submit that. They also were found guilty of pollution requirements, and they were suspended from operations in June of 2019, and currently are still suspended until they actually put in place the rectifying measures, the remedial measures that need to be enhanced, and they need to do that in cooperation and under the supervision of authorities. So, in addition to that, they were charged US $4,000 in fines. But the more important part is they were closed down from their operations for such a period of time. They were not actually able to produce anything. It's a reputational harm, and it goes also to trying to make sure that any companies that are involved in the environmental sector are very connected to their community, their local community. That may be meaning outreach, and maybe even on making the local community understanding of what they're doing, their manufacturing policies, their environmental protection policies. It may even mean opening up their factory for tours to local community, especially the people in charge of that community, and then the People's Committee, province, and so forth. But that just gives an idea about going forward. It's very serious concerns for environment, not just from the fines perspective, but from reputational and other damages long term. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin, for sharing. Well, for the person who actually raised that question, feel free to reach out to Kevin for further information if you need more clarification. I'm afraid, yeah, we don't have many more questions that we can actually, discuss here further because of the time constraint. Thank you very much for your questions. We will certainly get back to you if you have left your email address with us, and we will write to you directly. As a wrapped up, I think the key takeaways from today's discussion is that there exists a strong business case for scaling up action on environmental management, definitely. Now you may say this can't happen to us, but we are in compliance, or we don't really have environmental problems at the moment, but these are common restraints or refrains. But remember that the consequences of not planning for the risks can be enormous, as demonstrated by my colleagues earlier. These risks can be potential, perceived, or real. Yeah. So because of our dependencies on biodiversity, environmental risks translate into risk to business, real risk to business actually, including the risk to your operations and also liability risks, regulatory risks, not to mention reputational and also financial risks. Every company, large or small, has some degree of exposure, I'm afraid, right? So therefore, action is required on all fronts by government, the private sector, civil society, and individuals. Companies today need to have a plan to manage such risks and deal with any consequences that arise in order to preserve a company's well-being overall. Trust that your action is never too small, as collectively we can make a material difference in preserving our biodiversity, our environment, our business and life in a more resilient and sustainable way. Remember that good environmental performance and business success are not mutually exclusive. By managing your company's environmental risks and getting ahead of this issue, you could be avoiding a fatal threat while positioning your firm to be the best. This brings us to the end of the webinar. We hope that you find this session to be useful and fruitful. If you have any questions or need any help, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. On behalf of Zico, thank you very much again for your time, and I hope you will join my colleagues in the other ESG series. And we would have a session on S, which is the social aspect of the ESG, on 3rd of December. Yeah, please stay tuned. Thank you very much again, and goodbye.